Have you ever felt that the more awake you become, the more distant you become from everyone around you, as if carrying a truth that no one wants to hear? You are not imagining it. Carl Jung warned that those who begin to see what others do not see become threats to the systems in which they live. Once you see through the illusion, they can no longer control you, and that's when they start to fear him. There is a silent price to the awakening of consciousness. The more you know yourself, the more you notice the masks that everyone wears, the more you understand the unconscious patterns that govern human behavior, the more you become an outsider in your own society. Jung called this individuation, the painful process of becoming who you really are, separated from collective expectations. But here's the truth that no one tells. The world doesn't want you to wake up. It needs you to stay asleep, consuming, obeying, following predefined scripts. When you start questioning, seeing beyond appearances, recognizing the psychological games that everyone plays unconsciously, you become dangerous. Not because he is violent, but because his mere presence exposes the falsehood of others. Jung noted that those who embark on the journey of self-knowledge often feel isolated. It's not paranoia. It is the reality of those who live with greater awareness in a world that operates on autopilot. You begin to see the projections, the collective neuroses, the unresolved complexes that move the masses, and this scares those who still live in unconsciousness. Deep knowledge about oneself and human nature is not a romantic blessing. It is a heavy responsibility. You see the unhealed wounds in people. You recognize the destructive patterns they repeat. You realize how society is built on collective illusions. And when you try to share that perception, you are rejected, misunderstood, even attacked. This video is not about feeling superior to others. It's about understanding why awakening consciousness often leads to isolation and how to navigate that reality without losing your humanity. Jung taught us that individuation is a solitary but necessary process. You cannot save others from your own unconsciousness, but you can learn to live authentically in a world that prefers illusion to truth. If you've made it this far, you probably already feel this weight, the feeling of seeing too much, knowing too much, understanding patterns that others ignore. You're not crazy, you are awakening. And yes, this comes at a price. 1. Masks falling. Have you ever noticed how people change completely depending on who is around? Jung called this persona, the social mask that everyone wears to fit expectations. But when you develop enough awareness, these masks become transparent. And this deeply bothers those who still need them to survive socially. The persona is not necessarily a bad thing. It is a tool for social adaptation. The problem arises when people completely identify with their masks, forgetting who they really are underneath them. They live playing roles, the successful professional, the perfect mother, the friend always available, the understanding partner. But you, with your expanded consciousness, can see beyond these representations. When you develop the ability to see through personas, something disturbing happens. You see the insecurity behind arrogance, the fear behind aggressiveness, the neediness behind exaggerated independence. You recognize the patterns, the psychological compensations, the unhealed wounds that motivate these behaviors, and people feel it, even unconsciously. Jung noted that those who can see beyond the masks often become uncomfortable for others, not because they judge, but because their mere presence exposes the artificiality of social interactions. When someone is playing a role and you can see through it, it creates a silent tension. The person feels that they cannot deceive you, and this leaves them vulnerable. The most fascinating thing is that you don't have to say anything. Your expanded consciousness emits an energy that disarms the defenses of others. They feel like you see things they'd rather keep hidden. That's why they start behaving strangely around you. They get defensive for no apparent reason, avoid deep conversations, or try to impress you in exaggerated ways. This ability to see through masks is not a mystical superpower. It's a result of the inner work you've done to recognize your own personas. When you accept your inner contradictions, when you integrate your rejected aspects, when you stop pretending to be who you are not, you develop a keen perception to identify when others are doing just that. The problem is that most people don't want to be really seen. They prefer the safety of their masks, even if it means living a superficial life. When you show up with your authenticity, when you refuse to participate in the social games based on falsehood, you become an uncomfortable mirror. Their presence silently questions their choices. That's why you feel increasingly isolated in social groups. Not because he is antisocial, but because he can no longer pretend that he does not see what he is seeing. You can no longer engage in empty conversation, smile at jokes you don't find funny, or agree with opinions you find superficial. Their authenticity becomes a silent threat to the world of appearances. 2. Collective fear. There is something that society fears more than violence or chaos: people who think for themselves. Jung realized that the collective unconscious functions as a force that keeps everyone aligned with accepted standards. When one deviates significantly from these patterns, not only out of rebellion, but out of genuine awareness, it awakens a primal fear in the group. This fear is not rational. It is instinctive, visceral, rooted in the collective unconscious. For millennia, human survival has depended on group cohesion. Anyone who thought differently, questioned traditions, or saw beyond established beliefs posed a threat to tribal stability. This mechanism still operates today, even in seemingly evolved societies. When you develop enough awareness to question collective narratives, to see through mass psychological manipulations, to recognize how fears and desires are exploited to control behaviors, you become dangerous to the system, not because it is revolutionary, but because its mere existence proves that it is possible to live outside the collective psychological matrix. The fear you arouse is not conscious. People can't articulate exactly why they feel uncomfortable around them. They just feel like you represent something they can't understand or control. Their mental independence makes them question their own choices, even if you never say anything about it. Jung noted that individuals in the process of individuation often face hostility from the group, not because they are aggressive, but because they are different in a way that exposes the conformity of others. Their refusal to follow predefined social scripts, to accept truths without question, to live according to the expectations of others, awakens an ancestral fear of social fragmentation. This fear manifests itself in many forms: attempts to bring you back into the fold through criticism, emotional blackmail, social isolation, or even direct attacks on your sanity. You're thinking too much. You're being paranoid. You need to be more normal, are phrases you've probably heard. It is not genuine advice. They are unconscious attempts to force you back into conformity. The most disturbing thing is to realize how this fear operates through people you love. Family, close friends, romantic partners may unconsciously try to sabotage your growth when it threatens the established dynamic. They prefer you to be predictable and controllable, even if it means less authentic and fulfilled. Understanding this mechanism is liberating and painful at the same time. Liberating, because you stop personally taking the negative reactions of others. Painful, because you realize how much humanity is still trapped in primitive patterns of social control. You see how the fear of genuine individuality keeps most people stuck in lives they didn't consciously choose. The irony is that your expanded consciousness, which should be celebrated as human evolution, is seen as a threat. But Jung reminded us that individuation is not an optional luxury. It is a psychological necessity. And those who have the courage to follow this path, despite the fear they arouse in others, are the true pioneers of human consciousness. If this hit home and you're ready to go deeper into who you really are, light, shadow and all, check out the SIM Method ebook. It's a down-to-earth guide that helps you reconnect with yourself in just 5 minutes a day. The link's waiting for you in the first pinned comment. 3. Silent power. There is a type of power that does not need to be demonstrated to be felt. Jung identified that people in the process of individuation develop a presence that influences environments without conscious effort. It is not manufactured charisma or psychological manipulation. It is the natural strength of those who know themselves deeply and no longer need to prove anything to anyone. This silent power is born from the integration of the inner opposites. When you accept your shadow, when you stop projecting your insecurities onto others, when you become comfortable with your contradictions, something fundamental changes in your energy. You stop looking for external validation because you found internal validation. And this emotional independence is perceived by everyone around you, even unconsciously. People sense when someone doesn't need them to feel complete. They sense when someone is not trying to impress, please, or manipulate. This absence of neurotic need creates an energetic vacuum that naturally attracts attention. You become interesting precisely because you are not trying to be interesting. You become influential because you're not seeking influence. Jung observed that individuated individuals often become gravitational centers in social groups, not because they try to lead, but because they represent something that others unconsciously desire, genuine authenticity. Their presence reminds others of what they could be if they had the courage to shed their masks and live according to their inner truth. This power is annoying because it cannot be copied or bought. It is not communication technique, social strategy, or performance. It is the result of deep inner work, of facing fears, of accepting rejected aspects of the personality. It is psychological achievement that can only be achieved through conscious suffering and genuine transformation. When you develop this silent power, you realize how most social interactions are based on neurotic power plays. People trying to feel superior by diminishing others, seeking attention through drama, manipulating emotions to get what they want. You see these patterns clearly, but you no longer need to participate in them. Your simple refusal to play these games is already a demonstration of power. What's most fascinating is how this power manifests itself in conflict situations. While others get out of control, you stay centered. While others attack or defend themselves desperately, you watch with genuine curiosity. Their emotional stability in the midst of the chaos of others is disturbing to those who still live at the mercy of unprocessed impulses. This power is also manifested in the ability to say no without blame, to set limits without aggressiveness, to express opinions without the need to convince anyone. You speak your truth and let others do whatever they want with it. He does not argue. He does not justify himself excessively. He does not try to prove that he is right. Your truth exists regardless of the approval of others. Jung warned that this power attracts both admiration and resentment. Conscious people recognize and respect their authenticity. Unconscious people feel threatened and may try to attack or diminish you. Understanding this dynamic is essential to navigating the world without losing its integrity. Silent power is not about dominating others. It's about mastering yourself. It's about not being controlled by fears, insecurities, neurotic needs, or social expectations. It's the freedom to be who you really are, regardless of the social consequences. And that freedom, ironically, is what makes you truly powerful. 4. Shadow revealed. The most disturbing discovery on the path of self-knowledge is realizing that you can recognize in others exactly what you reject most about yourself. Jung called this shadow projection, and when you develop enough awareness to collect these projections, something frightening happens. You start to see the unintegrated shadow of everyone around you. The shadow is not just the negative aspects of the personality. It is everything that has been repressed, denied, or rejected during psychological development. It includes undeveloped potentials, unprocessed emotions, unaccepted impulses, and even positive qualities that the person does not allow themselves to express. When you integrate your own shadow, you develop a keen perception to identify what others are hiding from themselves. This ability is both a gift and a curse. You see the pent-up anger behind excessive kindness, the insecurity behind arrogance, the neediness behind forced independence, the envy behind false compliments. You recognize when someone is compensating for an unhealed wound through extreme behaviors. And people feel like you see what they'd rather keep hidden. Jung observed that individuals who have done the work of shadow integration often become uncomfortable mirrors to others. Its presence awakens unconscious contents that people are not prepared to face. That's why you may notice that certain people become agitated, defensive, or even aggressive around you for no apparent reason. You're activating psychological material that they'd rather keep buried. The most challenging thing is to realize how the entire society operates based on non-integrated collective shadows. Prejudices, irrational fears, scapegoating, political or religious fanaticism are manifestations of dark content projected onto external groups. When you see these mechanisms clearly, it becomes difficult to participate in discussions that are actually collective shadow projection rituals. Your ability to see through these projections causes you to question narratives that most accept without question. You notice how entire groups elect external enemies so as not to confront their own rejected aspects. You see how hatred directed at others is often hatred of denied parts of oneself. And this perception isolates you from collective movements based on projection. Shadow revelation also includes recognizing your own undeveloped potentials. Maybe you've stifled your creativity, your sexiness, your healthy aggression, or your leadership skills. Integrating these aspects means recovering vital parts of oneself that have been sacrificed to fit family or societal expectations. When you stop projecting your shadow and start consciously integrating it, something powerful happens. You become less judgmental and more compassionate. You understand that everyone carries rejected aspects, that everyone struggles with contradictory impulses, that everyone has unfulfilled potentials. This understanding makes you more human, but also more lonely, because few are willing to do this inner work. Jung warned that shadow integration is a process that never completely ends. There are always new aspects to be discovered and integrated, but those who embark on this journey develop an authenticity and a presence that bothers those who still live denying fundamental parts of themselves. Their psychological integrity becomes a silent reminder of the work that others avoid doing. 5. Lost control. The most liberating and terrifying moment of individuation is when you realize that you can no longer be manipulated by the same tactics that worked before. Jung identified that conscious people develop a natural immunity to psychological manipulation, emotional blackmail, and attempts at control, and this arouses panic in those who depend on these strategies to maintain relationships and positions of power. When you deeply know your own fears, insecurities, and neurotic needs, it becomes very difficult for others to use those vulnerabilities against you. You recognize when someone is trying to make you feel guilty, when they're projecting their own insecurities onto you, when they're using conditional love to control you. This clarity is liberating for you, but terrifying for those who have always managed to manipulate you. Manipulation works by exploiting psychological blind spots. Fear of abandonment, need for approval, unprocessed guilt, internalized shame, inferiority or superiority complexes. When you do the inner work of recognizing and integrating these aspects, they stop being buttons that others can push to control you. You develop an internal stability that doesn't rely on external validation. Jung observed that relationships based on dynamics of control enter into crisis when one of the parties awakens consciousness. Parents who control children through guilt, partners who manipulate through jealousy, bosses who dominate through fear, friends who exploit insecurities. All of these patterns become ineffective when you develop clarity about your own psychological patterns. What's most disturbing is realizing how many relationships in your life were based on some kind of mutual control. You gave something the person needed, validation, safety, entertainment, resources, in exchange for something you thought they needed. Love, acceptance, protection, status. When you stop desperately needing these things, the relationship can collapse or transform completely. This emotional independence is interpreted as a threat by people who depend on controlling others to feel safe. They can intensify attempts at manipulation, create drama to get attention, use more extreme emotional blackmail, or even attack you directly. They can't understand how you became immune to tactics that have always worked. The loss of control over you awakens primal fear in these people. They feel like they're missing out on something valuable, even if that something was their psychological submission. So they may react with anger, despair, or increasingly desperate attempts to bring you back to the previous pattern. They can't accept that you've fundamentally changed. Jung warned that this phase of individuation often results in loss of relationships. People who could only relate through control dynamics simply don't know how to connect with someone genuinely independent. They prefer to walk away rather than learn new forms of relationships based on mutual respect and authenticity. The most challenging aspect is to maintain compassion for these people without allowing them to control you again. You understand that they act like this out of fear, insecurity, unhealed wounds. But they also understand that allowing themselves to be controlled does not help them grow. It only perpetuates destructive patterns. Their refusal to participate in these games is paradoxically an act of true love. When you can no longer be controlled, you become truly free. But this freedom comes at a price: the loneliness of those who live outside the conventional patterns of relationships. Jung reminded us that individuation is a lonely path, but it is the only path to a life that is authentically yours. 6. Unbearable truth. There is a kind of truth that people prefer not to hear, even when they know they need it. Jung realized that conscious individuals often become bearers of inconvenient truths, not by choice, but because their mental clarity makes it impossible to participate in collective illusions. And this puts them in an extremely uncomfortable social position. When you develop the ability to see psychological patterns clearly, it becomes difficult to pretend that you don't see what you're seeing. You recognize when someone is sabotaging themselves, when they are repeating destructive cycles, when they are living in denial about fundamental aspects of their life. And often, their mere presence or honest comments expose those truths that the person would rather keep hidden. The unbearable truth is not necessarily cruel or judgmental. It may simply be the observation that someone is unhappy in a relationship they insist on maintaining, that they are wasting talents in a career they hate, that they are repeating destructive family patterns, or that they are using addictions to avoid facing emotional pain. Obvious truths that everyone around can see, but no one has the courage to verbalize. Jung observed that people in the process of individuation often become mirrors that reflect aspects that others prefer to ignore. not because they are critical or superior, but because their authenticity contrasts with the falsehood that others have accepted as normal. Their refusal to engage in superficial conversations, to validate illusions, or to pretend that obvious problems do not exist can be interpreted as judgment. What's more challenging is that these truths emerge naturally from your presence, even when you try to be diplomatic. Your integrated energy, your emotional clarity, your refusal to participate in neurotic dramas already communicates truths that others do not want to face. You don't have to say anything for people to feel confronted with aspects of their lives that they prefer to avoid. This dynamic creates a complex social dilemma. You can choose to be fake to maintain superficial relationships, or you can be authentic and face the isolation that comes with honesty. Jung warned that individuation often requires choosing truth over popularity, integrity over social acceptance. People may come to you when they're in crisis, seeking your clear and honest perspective. But when the crisis passes, they often drift away because their presence reminds them of truths they prefer to forget. They want your wisdom when they are desperate, but they reject your honesty when they are comfortable in their illusions. The unbearable truth also includes acknowledging fundamental human limitations. Most people don't want to grow up if it requires discomfort. You don't want to face your shadows if it means questioning your self-image. You don't want to take responsibility for your choices if it means difficult changes. Accepting these limitations is painful, but necessary to maintain sanity. Jung taught us that those who carry inconvenient truths have a special responsibility. They must not force these truths on others, but neither must they deny them in order to please. The balance lies in living your truth authentically, allowing others to choose whether they want to move closer to or away from that honesty. The loneliness that comes with being the bearer of unbearable truths is real, but Jung reminded us that it is better to be alone with your integrity than to be accompanied in falsehood. Your honesty may bother many, but it can also inspire those few who are ready to face their own truths. 7. Inevitable rejection. The deepest pain of individuation is not discovering your own wounds, but realizing that your healing troubles those who have chosen to remain wounded. Jung identified that people in the process of psychological growth often face systematic rejection, not because they are problematic, but because they represent possibilities that others do not have the courage to explore. When you begin to heal toxic family patterns, you may find that your family prefers you to be sick and predictable. Her mental health exposes the dysfunctionality that everyone has accepted as normal. Their refusal to participate in destructive dynamics breaks a neurotic balance that has existed for generations. And this can result in family ostracism, even when you don't criticize anyone directly. Rejection also comes from social groups that function based on shared grievances, collective dramas, or mutual addictions. When you stop feeding these dynamics, when you refuse to participate in gossip, when you no longer buy into other people's dramas, when you stop validating chronic victimization, you can be excluded from these social circles. Their emotional health becomes a threat to group identity. Jung noted that the most painful rejection often comes from people you love who should celebrate your growth. Romantic partners may feel threatened by their emotional independence. Close friends may resent your mental clarity. Family members may interpret their authenticity as a judgment of their choices. The love you feel for these people makes the rejection even more devastating. The most confusing aspect of this rejection is that it often comes disguised as worry. You're changing too much. You're not the same person anymore. You're isolating yourself. You need to be more flexible. These phrases sound like care, but they're actually attempts to bring you back to standards that serve the needs of others, not your own. Rejection also manifests itself through subtle sabotage. People may try to convince you to go back to old behaviors, create situations that test your new emotional stability or even attack you in moments of greatest vulnerability. They don't do it consciously, but something about them can't bear to see you free of patterns that they still carry. Jung warned that this phase of individuation can be extremely lonely. You can find yourself without the old relationships, but you still haven't found people who resonate with who you've become. It is a period of transition where you no longer belong to the world you left, but you have not yet found your new place in the world. The temptation during this phase is to go back, accept superficial relationships, pretend you haven't grown up, dim your light so as not to bother others. But Jung reminded us that regressing psychologically to maintain relationships is a betrayal of your own soul. It is choosing external approval over internal integrity. The most painful thing is to realize that some people could only relate to their wounds, not to their essence. They connected with their neediness, their insecurity, their need for validation. When you heal those wounds, you find that there wasn't much else sustaining those relationships. The person they loved was actually a diminished version of who you really are. Understanding that rejection is inevitable on the path of individuation does not make the pain less, but it does make the process more bearable. You stop taking it personally and start seeing it as a natural part of psychological growth. Jung taught us that those who have the courage to be rejected for being authentic eventually find people capable of loving who they really are. 8. Dangerous awakening. The real danger of awakening is not in what you discover about the world, but in what you become able to do when you stop accepting limitations that others have imposed on you. Jung realized that completely individuated individuals pose an existential threat to systems based on conformity, dependency, and psychological control. When you fully awaken to your own power, when you integrate all the rejected aspects of your personality, when you stop seeking external approval to validate your choices, you become unpredictable to those who depend on your predictability. Their psychological freedom silently questions the mental prisons that others have accepted as inevitable. Dangerous awakening includes recognizing that most of the limitations you have accepted during your life were imposed by people who had a vested interest in keeping you small. Parents who discouraged your dreams for fear that you would outgrow them. Teachers who have limited their possibilities to maintain control. Partners who sabotaged your trust to ensure your dependence. Society that convinced you that certain things were impossible for people like you. Jung noted that full awakening often results in radical life changes that frighten outside observers. People leave safe careers to pursue authentic purposes. They abandon toxic relationships, even when it means temporary loneliness. They refuse to participate in systems that violate their values, even when doing so has financial or social costs. This transformation is dangerous because it is contagious. When others see someone living authentically, they question their own fear-based choices. When they see someone refusing to accept imposed limitations, they begin to question their own mental prisons. When they see someone thriving outside of conventional patterns, they realize that they could also make different choices. The most ominous aspect of awakening is that it reveals how many social, economic, and even family systems depend on people who do not know their own power. Works that exploit insecurities, relationships based on codependency, institutions that profit from ignorance. All of these systems tremble when confronted with individuals who are completely aware of their capabilities. Your awakening is also dangerous for yourself. When you recognize all your unfulfilled potential, when you see clearly how you've wasted years living up to other people's expectations, when you understand the price you've paid for social approval, you can experience deep anger. This anger, if not consciously processed, can become destructive. Jung warned that full awakening requires total responsibility. You can no longer blame others for your choices. You can no longer play the victim of circumstances. You can no longer use ignorance as an excuse for inaction. With great awareness comes great responsibility, and not everyone is prepared for this weight. The dangerous awakening also includes recognizing that you have the power to influence realities, to create meaningful change, to impact lives in ways you previously thought impossible. This power scares not only others, but also yourself. It's easier to live believing that you're limited than it is to take responsibility for using your gifts completely. That is why many people stop in the middle of the individuation process. They awaken enough to feel superior to the sleepers, but not enough to take full responsibility for their lives. Jung reminded us that true awakening is not about feeling special, but about becoming completely responsible for the reality you create. 9. Lucid solitude. The deepest loneliness is not being physically alone, but being psychologically isolated in the midst of crowds living at levels of consciousness completely different from your own. Jung identified that individuation inevitably leads to a specific form of loneliness, the loneliness of those who see clearly in a world that prefers illusion. When you develop enough mental clarity to recognize the unconscious patterns, psychological manipulations, and neurotic dynamics that govern most human interactions, it becomes extremely difficult to find people you can authentically connect with. You can no longer feign interest in superficial conversations. You can no longer participate in unnecessary drama. You can no longer validate illusions that others need to maintain in order to feel safe. This loneliness is different from ordinary loneliness. It is not a lack or neurotic need for company. It is the natural isolation of those who operate in a different psychological frequency than the majority. You may be surrounded by people and still feel deeply alone because no one around you can access the levels of depth where you naturally dwell. Jung noted that individuals in advanced stages of individuation often experience a form of psychological exile. They can no longer relate to concerns they consider trivial. They can no longer be moved by dramas that they recognize as projections. They can no longer participate in discussions that they know are based on ignorance or bad faith. The most challenging aspect of this loneliness is that it cannot be cured through more superficial relationships. You may try to force yourself to participate in conventional social activities. You may try to feign interest in subjects you consider irrelevant. You may try to tone down your intensity to suit groups, but this only intensifies the feeling of isolation. You feel even more alone when you're pretending to be someone you're not. Lucid solitude also includes carrying perceptions that others are not ready to hear. You see destructive family patterns that have been repeating for generations. You recognize social dynamics based on fear and control. You understand how entire systems work by exploiting psychological ignorance. But sharing these perceptions often results in rejection, denial, or even hostility. Jung warned that this phase of individuation can be extremely tempting for the ego. The temptation is to feel superior to the unconscious, to develop spiritual arrogance, or to use your clarity as a weapon to judge others. But true psychological maturity includes understanding that each person is at their own stage of development, and that your loneliness doesn't make you better than anyone else. Lucid solitude can also be a period of great creativity and inner growth. When you stop wasting energy trying to conform to patterns that don't resonate with your essence, when you accept that you can be alone for long periods, when you learn to find companionship in your own depth, something powerful happens. You develop an intimate relationship with yourself that is independent of external validation. The most paradoxical thing is that fully accepting this loneliness often attracts people who operate in similar frequencies. When you stop trying to force superficial connections, when you become comfortable with your own company, when you radiate authenticity without needing approval, You naturally magnetize other individuals who have also done this inner work. Jung reminded us that lucid solitude is not punishment, but preparation. It's the period it takes for you to become strong enough to maintain your integrity in a world that constantly tries to convince you to be less than you are. It's the time it takes for you to develop inner roots so deep that no external storm can bring you down. 10. Threatening individuation. The final stage of individuation is when you become completely yourself, regardless of the social consequences. Jung realized that fully individuated individuals pose the greatest possible threat to conformity-based systems. They prove that it is possible to live authentically and thrive outside the standards imposed by society. When you complete the process of individuation, something fundamental changes in your presence. You no longer need to prove anything to anyone. You no longer seek external approval. You no longer fear rejection. You no longer diminish yourself to please others. You simply exist as you are, with no masks, no compensations, no need for validation. And this radical authenticity is deeply threatening to those who still live trapped in social roles. Complete individuation means that you have integrated all aspects of your personality, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, rational and emotional, individual and collective. You no longer reject parts of yourself. You no longer project your insecurities onto others. You no longer seek fulfillment through external relationships. You have become a complete human being, and this completeness exposes the fragmentation of others. Jung observed that fully individuated individuals are often seen as dangerous by social institutions, not because they are rebellious or destructive, but because their very existence calls into question the need for many control structures. They don't need outside authorities to tell them how to live. They don't rely on systems to define their value. They don't need collective approval to validate their choices. This complete psychological independence is threatening because it is contagious. When others see someone living with complete authenticity and thriving, they begin to question their own mental prisons. You begin to realize that many of the limitations you have accepted have been imposed out of fear, not real necessity. They begin to consider the possibility of also living according to their inner truth. Threatening individuation also includes the ability to see through all forms of psychological manipulation. You recognize when politicians exploit primal fears, when media use mind control techniques, when religious institutions manipulate guilt and shame, when economic systems depend on psychological insecurity. Your immunity to these manipulations poses a threat to those who profit from them. The most disturbing aspect of complete individuation is that it reveals how society depends on people who do not know their own power. Works that exploit insecurities, relationships based on codependency, political systems that rely on ignorance, institutions that profit from fear, all tremble before individuals who fully know their own worth and power. Jung warned that complete individuation is not a state of perfection, but of total authenticity. You still make mistakes, you still have limitations, you still face challenges, but you face them as yourself, not as an edited version created to please others. You live your life according to your values, not the expectations of others. The ultimate threat of individuation is that it proves that psychological freedom is possible. In a world that works by convincing people that they need external systems to survive, to have value, to find purpose, your existence as a complete and independent human being is a silent declaration that another way of living is possible. That is why Jung reminded us that individuation is not just a personal process, but a service to humanity. Each person who has the courage to become completely authentic paves the way for others to discover their own truth as well. Your threatening individuation is not selfishness, but the greatest gift you can give to the world, living proof that inner freedom is possible.